October 31st, 1942. The North Atlantic, 600 miles west of Ireland. HMS Viscount, a V-class destroyer commissioned in 1918, detects a submerged contact on her ASDIC at 1,200 yards. She is 24 years old. Her engines have been condemned as unreliable by 2 successive engineering officers. Her depth charge racks are worn. Her hull plating has been repaired so many times that her own dockyard crew referred to her in writing as structurally marginal. The U-boat she has just found is U-619, a type VIIC, 769-ton submerged, commissioned in 1942, crewed by 44 men, armed with 14 torpedoes and a 4.7-centimeter deck gun. It is the most common and most lethal submarine design in any navy. Viscount drops 2 patterns of depth charges. Nothing. The contact goes silent and evasive. She charges. At 14 knots, on a worn hull that should have been decommissioned, HMS Viscount rams U-619 amidships at a depth of approximately 50 feet, driving her bow through the pressure hull. The submarine sinks within minutes. All 44 German crew are lost. Viscount reaches port under her own power. The hole in her bow is 12 feet wide. That is not the extraordinary part. The extraordinary part is what it took to make a 24-year-old destroyer effective enough to survive a ramming attack in the North Atlantic in 1942. The answer is not luck. It is a set of institutional decisions made between 1939 and 1941 that transformed an obsolete hull into the most dangerous anti-submarine platform available at any cost. By 1939, the V and W class destroyers were the Royal Navy's embarrassment. Laid down between 1916 and 1918, they had been designed for fleet torpedo attacks in the North Sea at 34 knots. The war they were built for ended before half of them fired a shot in anger. The naval treaties of the 1920s prohibited replacing them. Budget cuts prevented modernizing them. By 1935, the Director of Naval Construction had recommended the entire class for scrapping within 5 years. They were too slow for fleet screening against modern torpedo craft. Their boilers leaked. Their oil fuel consumption at high speed was twice that of newer designs. Their gun armament, 4 4-inch quickfires and single mounts, was inferior to everything Germany had built since 1933. The German-type VIIC that Viscount would eventually kill had been designed from a hull-up for exactly the kind of warfare that would break old destroyers. Its operational diving depth exceeded 200 meters. Its surface speed of 17 knots and submerged speed of 7.6 knots made it faster submerged than many escorts could track on 1939-era ASDIC. Its silent running procedures, developed through 20 years of German tactical study, allowed it to approach convoys from ahead and down sun, firing from inside the escort screen before any surface ship could localize it. On paper, a 1918 destroyer chasing a 1941 submarine was a contest with a predetermined outcome. The convoy protection staff at Western Approaches Command knew it. They sent the V and W class anyway because in 1941 there was nothing else. What they did with that constraint is the actual story. The conversion program that changed everything was not a glamorous reconstruction. There was number £3 million refit. The Admiralty could not afford to rip these ships down to their keels and rebuild them. What they could afford was a systematic stripping of everything that did not contribute to anti-submarine warfare, followed by the installation of the best available detection and attack equipment on the resulting platform. The program was designated WWII for short-range air defense, but its most important output was anti-submarine lethality. The forward boiler room was removed entirely. The weight saved, approximately 60 tons, went into new equipment and structural reinforcement for depth charge attack. The bow section was rebuilt to accept the Hedgehog, a 24-spigot ahead throwing mortar that fired a spread of 65-pound contact-fused projectiles 230 yards ahead of the ship while ASDIC contact was still held. Before Hedgehog, a destroyer attacking a submarine had to lose contact during the final run-in, giving the U-boat commander between 15 and 45 seconds to maneuver clear of the pattern. Hedgehog ended that problem. Contact was maintained through the attack. The depth charges remained for follow-up attacks. Total depth charge capacity was increased to between 70 and 100 charges on modified ships. 2 stern rails and 4 throwers could put a full 10 charge pattern down in a single pass. Maximum depth charge setting was increased progressively from 350 feet to 500 feet to match improving intelligence on U-boat diving limits. The ASDIC set itself was replaced. The original 1918 equipment could hold contact to approximately 1,200 yards under good conditions and was vulnerable to thermal layers and wake interference. The Type 144 and later Type 147B sets fitted during conversion used a narrow transmitting beam and faster sweep rates. The 147B added a tilting transducer that could follow a diving contact through depth changes that previously caused contact loss. This was not a marginal improvement. It was the difference between detecting a submarine on its final evasion dive and losing it entirely. Speed was sacrificed deliberately. The forward boiler removal dropped these ships from a theoretical 34 knots, which they had never achieved in service by 1941 anyway, to approximately 24 to 25 knots in good condition. The Admiralty accepted this. A convoy escort did not need 34 knots. It needed to be faster than 7.6 knots submerged, which everything afloat exceeded comfortably, and it needed the endurance to stay on station for the 10 to 12-day crossing. The boiler removal increased endurance by approximately 40% at economical speed. If you find this kind of deep dive into how the Royal Navy thought its way to victory more interesting than the standard biography-driven naval history, subscribing takes a moment and helps the channel. The conversion reached HMS Viscount in 1941 at Devonport. She received Hedgehog. She received the Type 144 ASDIC. Her after 4-inch gun was replaced by a twin 20mm Oerlikon mount. Her depth charge stowage was increased to 95 charges. Her complement was reduced from 134 to 112 as accommodation was converted to equipment space. The commanding officer who took her back out to the Atlantic, Lieutenant Commander Ernest Waterhouse, had spent 18 months in Western Approaches Training Command studying the tactical lessons of every convoy battle since 1939. He was 31 years old. He had never commanded a destroyer before this appointment. The Battle of the Atlantic by mid-1942 was a crisis that the official records did not fully convey to the British public. Donitz had assembled over 100 operational U-boats. Monthly tonnage sunk had reached 700,000 tons in June 1942. The American eastern seaboard, initially unescorted, had been devastated. The convoy routing system that Churchill described privately as the only thing that truly frightened him during the entire war was under sustained coordinated assault by wolf packs directed from shore by high-frequency radio. Using Enigma-encrypted traffic, the British could not yet read reliably enough to be decisive. The escort group that Viscount joined was B-3, one of the Western Approach's mid-ocean escort groups. B-3 in late 1942 consisted of a senior officer's destroyer and 4 to 5 corvettes, with 1 or 2 additional destroyers attached as available. The gap between Iceland air cover and the range of Coastal Command aircraft flying from Northern Ireland remained unprotected for approximately 700 miles. It was in this gap, known within Western Approaches as the Black Pit, that the majority of convoy losses occurred. Viscount worked in the Black Pit. The engagement that produced the ramming was tactically straightforward by the standards of what these crews had learned to accept as routine. Convoy SC107 had already lost 15 ships in a running 4-day battle with a wolf pack before Viscount found U-619. The detection was made at dusk on October 31st under conditions that the ASDIC operators later described as moderately difficult, a slight thermal layer at 80 feet reducing return quality. Waterhouse made 2 depth charge attacks that produced no result. Standard procedure called for a 3rd attack and then a search pattern. On the 3rd run, ASDIC contact was held to 200 yards and then lost as the submarine went deep. Waterhouse accelerated to maximum speed and followed the last bearing. At 14 knots, with ASDIC silent and the contact lost, he held course for 40 seconds. The ramming was deliberate. It was also a calculated risk that could have sunk Viscount instead of U-619. A destroyer bow driven into a pressure hull at 14 knots transfers enormous energy in both directions. The submarine structure collapses. The destroyer bow crumples. The question is whether the crumpling propagates to the waterline and below. In at least 2 other cases in the North Atlantic during the same period, ramming attacks sank the attacker alongside the submarine. Waterhouse had studied those cases. He had calculated the angle of attack, the depth of the contact, and the speed at impact. He had also decided that at that moment in that convoy battle, with 15 ships already gone, the mathematics favored the attempt. The German crew had no time to respond. U-619 was struck at approximately 60 feet depth, which placed the impact point at the conning tower base and forward pressure hull junction, the section most vulnerable to transverse loading and least reinforced by internal framing. Flooding was immediate and uncontrollable. All 44 crew were lost. U-619 never surfaced. Viscount reached Londonderry 8 days later with temporary patches on her bow fitted by her own engineering department using materials carried for exactly this contingency. She was in Devonport for repair for 6 weeks. She went back to the North Atlantic. The strategic consequence of Convoy SC107 was not Viscount's kill. The sinking of 15 merchant ships in one convoy was a catastrophe that accelerated the crisis Churchill had been managing since 1940. But the individual kill of U-619 was one of approximately 40 U-boat losses in the Atlantic between August and December 1942. Those 40 losses, distributed across a force that Donitz could not replace faster than one boat per week without degrading crew quality, began to shift the exchange rate that determined whether the wolf pack strategy was sustainable. By May 1943, the rate of U-boat losses had reached the point where Donitz withdrew the wolf packs from the North Atlantic entirely. The conversion program, the Hedgehog, the improved ASDIC, the training at Western approaches, the tactical doctrine that produced commanding officers who would ram a submarine in the dark rather than break off contact. That combination killed more submarines than any single weapon system, any single ship class, or any single engagement in the entire Atlantic campaign. HMS Viscount was sold for scrapping in 1945. She had been condemned as structurally marginal in 1941. She served 4 more years. The V and W class as a whole sank or shared in the sinking of 28 U-boats during the war. They escorted over 1,200 convoys. They were the oldest destroyer class in continuous frontline service in any navy at war between 1939 and 1945. The Director of Naval Construction had recommended scrapping them by 1940. The critics judged the hull. The Admiralty judged the mission. The mission was not fleet torpedo attacks at 34 knots in the North Sea. The mission was keeping a submarine down long enough, tracking it accurately enough, and delivering enough high explosive close enough that 44 men inside a steel tube 200 feet underwater had no further options. For that mission, a 24-year-old hull with Hedgehog, a Type 147B ASDIC, 95 depth charges, and a commanding officer trained by Western approaches was not obsolete. It was, specification for specification, better suited than anything else available. The ramming that sank U-619 was not a desperate last act. It was the logical conclusion of a system designed to close with submarines and kill them by any means available. The hole in Viscount's bow was 12 feet wide. She reached port anyway. The Director of Naval Construction had called her structurally marginal. He had not asked what she was marginal for.